think the role of the media is always the same, in the sense that it's finding the truth, telling that truth, communicating it, and also disproving untruths that may be around, or at the very least giving context. I do think the whole coronavirus crisis has obviously heightened certain difficulties. We can see that there is a general sense of fear and uncertainty that's among everyone really right now, and that is also having an impact on some of the narratives and the response to them in our audiences. I think what journalists can do is sort of tell the truth and be wary of language and images. We heard Donald Trump, President Donald Trump, for a long time, he still does it now, talk about the Chinese virus when it started. We did hear across Europe of racist incidents against people of an Asian background. So there was a fear that often mixed with ignorance leads to that. It was very interesting in Italy, though, when it comes to public opinion, then when the focus of COVID-19 was on Italy, and many Italians found themselves being stigmatized abroad and a lot of travel being stopped. It's interesting how then they realized how often unfair that could be. I think there's always an element of truth, in the sense that we did have high cases. It did originate from Wuhan. We did have high cases in Italy. I think journalists, beyond telling the truth, have to be careful about some things that could happen without meaning to. So, for example, I noticed that for a long time, because the disease started in Wuhan, and certainly China is where we heard about it first, in the background, so when you have a TV studio, in the background there would be images of Chinese people and the Chinese context. And that continued for not much longer, but for a while, when after it became obvious it wasn't just a Chinese issue. So it's little things like that that sometimes can happen by mistake that could almost cement certain views. But otherwise, it's really just telling the truth, sticking to the facts, making it very clear, and trying to gain the trust of an audience, which at that point, and even now, is pretty scared. There's two different issues there, because I think what it's having is a realistic impact on human mobility. And so that in turn affects the way journalists talk about it. I mean, a lot of us are used to, especially within Europe, to get on a plane, not almost as often as I get a bus, but not far off. And all of that seems to have stopped. And then, of course, there's migration. There's a lot of talks about borders. There's a lot of bubble zones that are being created where certain countries allow from just their immediate neighbors. So, the whole issue of travel and entering and crossing borders has changed, and journalists in turn have to reflect that. Now, whether the changes will create a further hostility, we'll have to see. I think certainly what governments do in this case will be crucial. So the whole tracking and tracing issue will be crucial. And I think another thing in the narratives is that we don't have to talk about ethnicities, but I think we should talk about places people are from. So to give you an example, there was a truth that the virus originated in China. So it's a detail of language, which I think actually matters. So you don't say we're going to stop the Chinese. You're going to say you're going to stop people who come from China, because at the end of the day, it was a geographical issue. If you were in Lombardy, it didn't matter if you were Italian or not. You were in an area that was at a high risk with a high contagion rate. So I think those slight differences, I think journalists will be aware of and paying attention to. I do think the fact that now it's become a global pandemic means there's less of an issue of the initial blame game that there was at the start of the crisis. But I think all of it depends on what is put in place by the governments. And I think right now, it seems very, very uncertain, and public opinion will play a part. And I think there will be one discussion for the developed world. So I think we're going to see one narrative about travel within the EU or Europe, and potentially a totally different one when it comes to travel outside of Europe, even though many countries have not had as high contagion rates as Europe. But I still think the borders will be strict. got a sort of dual career. So I'm a senior presenter with Al Jazeera, but because I'm originally from Italy, I do a lot of work in Italian national media. And obviously I've been living I used to work for British media and have lived here for more than 25 years in London. So starting with Al Jazeera, have the views changed? So first of all, I would say that the Al Jazeera audience per se is more educated about the world, crucially more interested about the world. I think interest is at the core of all of this. And so because they have the interest, they will read more, follow us more, and generally know more. But I would say that the fear that COVID-19 has brought about has been pretty universal. And you've seen borders go up and, very stringent migrant measures emerge across the world. And you've seen a lot of migrants in a lot of places around the world almost caught in a situation where they couldn't work, they couldn't go back home, and, had relative access to healthcare. And I think that has been quite global, even in parts of Southern Africa, everywhere. So has it changed the attitudes to migration? I think in general, it's done because of the fear, and also the knowledge that we have a difficult economic time ahead. I think everyone is more fearful, and I think fear is always the precursor to some kind of resistance to outsiders. It's more like, the whole let's take care of our own, that kind of narrative that you often have coming from nationalist parties. But I do also think it has brought up a lot of empathy. I do think the stories, they've really resonated with me, and I do think it resonated with viewers as well. We are all at home, we are all, desperately washing our hands, and all of a sudden you empathize in a way that perhaps you didn't before with people in refugee camps. I'm thinking of Greece specifically, just to keep it sort of within Europe, where you don't just go to the nearest sink to wash your hands because they're under pressure. There's a massive queue. If you've got kids, how do you socially distance? How do you wash your hands? How do you take care of the hygienic impact? And I think because I don't think COVID-19 was an equalizer, but I do think it made us all do similar things, the people that could and the people that couldn't. And all of a sudden, I do think the empathy was more felt. All of a sudden, I think a lot of people actually sat down and thought, okay, what is it like to be in a migrant camp? Because all of a sudden we had to, being at home was, having a home was obviously crucial. So I do think, to look a bit on the positive side, that it heightened empathy, and it also heightened appreciation. Here in the UK, the key workers, every Thursday we go outside our houses and clap at 8 p.m., for the health workers, but really key workers, the people that have kept the country going at, considerable personal risk of contagion. So I think there is a level of appreciation there as well. So empathy, appreciation, but I do think we need to accept that there is an element of fear, that the future is very uncertain, and that migration issues may well suffer from it, both in the perception, but also probably in the actual legislation. Certainly in the UK, because, we still have Brexit going on, not that anyone has mentioned it in the past few months, but, this is the country where Brexit dominated the agenda for years. And there was a lot of emphasis on skilled and unskilled labor. So the narrative here from the pro-Brexit camp was, it's not necessarily just about lowering migration, it's about choosing who you let in, and we want high-skilled migrants. Well, guess what? Then COVID-19 happens, and you realize that actually you need people to deliver your food and your shopping, not quite as much maybe as lawyers. Everyone has their role, but you certainly need those workers. And then, of course, there's the health workers that have that particular skill. So I do think there was an appreciation. And I do think it's stories, especially the ones that unfortunately died due to contagion, a lot of the health workers, it's when you connect on a personal level. And then you realize that it's not just about skilled labor, it's about people doing their bit, and especially at a time when, to take care of your grandmother, someone is risking their life. So I do think that had a huge impact in the way key workers are seen. And when it comes to public opinion, it was remarkable what happened here a few weeks ago, where basically there's this situation where migrant workers had to pay for the NHS, a surcharge, a yearly, that's National Health Service, people who sort of, passport holding British citizens, we pay through our taxes, and there was a system whereby migrant workers had to pay additionally. And there was such an outcry in public opinion, even from sections of the media that are normally more aligned with the government and normally more aligned with right-way thinking, that even though Boris Johnson at one point put his foot down and said, no, we still need to keep it, there was such public opinion against it, such strength of feeling, that in the end the government scrapped it, or extended it for a while, saying that if you are a migrant working for the National Health Service, you don't have to pay extra to then use the service that you have been risking your life for. And that's remarkable. I mean, the fact that public opinion really swayed that, and something that had been policy for a while. So that policy had been decided on. And then COVID-19 happened and views changed. And I think because a lot of people realized. So listen, I think there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. I think at the heart of all coverage of migration issues are personal stories. It's finding the person, their backstory, their emotion, and it's about connecting. You can talk about statistics all you like. It's never going to get through to the viewer or the listener or the reader the way it is when they just read a story about, a parent, someone taking care of their children, or whatever their situation is that you can relate to. And I think what COVID-19 did, and tragically often because it was health workers or key workers that ended up dying because of exposure, I think what it did is make that connection at a time when everyone feels vulnerable. And so maybe we are also reaching out on a more human level. I think there is an in-between migration crisis and migration capital, right? I think there's two different narratives. So we mentioned 2015 and the COVID crisis, but I think the points that always, and that I always try to bring out in my journalism in Italy, first of all, this idea that a lot of Southern European countries have, that the whole of Africa is coming over. Most African migration is within the continent. Most economic migrants coming from Africa stay within Africa, and not just refugees as well from Africa. So this idea that the whole of Africa is coming over is in itself wrong. And I mean, you say statistics, and I said we shouldn't talk about numbers too much because they lose people, but that is very important. And then that's the economic migrant side of things. Then, of course, there was the refugees from the ongoing conflict in Syria, which is still not resolved. I mean, it's quietened from 2015, but, up until not that long ago, there is obviously still a conflict. And I think, again, there the numbers is, well, try telling Jordan, a country, that isn't very big, that 1 million people is an invasion, because Jordan had as many refugees there that the whole of Europe. Try telling Turkey, for all the flaws of the EU-Turkey deal, they've taken more than 3 million refugees. So I think it was always those numbers, because I think there was a fear, used by a lot of nationalist parties, absolutely, but there is this fear that people in Europe think, oh my goodness, Africa is so devastated by war and poverty, they're all going to come over, take what we have, there isn't going to be enough. And I think key to that is also, if we focus on the economic migrant issue, which I think is the one that potentially gets demonized more in Europe. So if you look at the economic migrant, I think it's also about showing Africa as the vibrant continent that it is. Yes, of course, there's parts of it that are blighted by poverty. And yes, of course, there are countries with wars that have been dragging on for ages. But the 80% internal mobility within the continent also shows you that there's lots of parts of Africa that are vibrant. And so I think it's about showing the countries of origin, the reasons why a lot of these, young or not so young people are choosing to come across. I think that is more how you fight it, necessarily how you fight the sort of stigmatizing than COVID-19. So if you see what I mean, I think that what we saw in 2015, you don't need COVID-19 to fight it. There was, in our information, in our communication, there's other points to bring up that I think would make it easier. Then, as far as migration as a resource, I mean, yes, absolutely. And then that goes back to to the point I was making earlier about using we call them test cases, which is an ugly way of saying we need to talk to people. So instead of like numbers and press releases, you know, an actual interview with a person who tells you their story face to face. And the difficulty here for a lot of the European countries that we don't necessarily have on English speaking channels like Al Jazeera or the BBC or CNN is language, you know, because there is the difficulty there. You know, I remember a great advantage that Al Jazeera had when the migration flows were coming in from you know, sort of from Greece, Turkey, Greece, and the Balkans. A lot of our correspondents speak Arabic. A lot of our correspondents would be able to tell you which part of Syria these people were from, and so could speak to the people. Now, you know, with the best will in the world, I don't expect every correspondent for Italian television or any other, you know, national television to be fluent in various types of Arabic. And so I think there is often a language barrier when it comes to getting through the Italian, the Greek, the Spanish audiences, which are exactly the audiences that we need to get through. I think, and again, it's easier said than done, yeah, because all these organizations try their hardest. So, but in an ideal world, I think you have to be ruthless about keeping it local and about keeping it national, but even localized. So when I broadcast, I mean, I'm not a different person, as in my message is obviously more or less the same, but the way I relate to my audience, if I'm on Al Jazeera, or if I am on a national Italian channel, or if I am in some piazza in Italy, when we still used to do that at some conference, you know, where you could relate with the audience, is almost completely different. And I think to succeed, you have to keep it at the very least national, because at a national level, the people organizing this, so let's say from the EU, will know what the counter narrative will be. And the counter narrative will always be different for every country. So the anti-migration narrative in the UK, for example, is different to the anti-migration narrative in Italy. There's different issues. So for the UK, it was a big thing about the EU, because of course, London is, you know, one of the capitals of the world. So a lot of EU citizens would go there. It would attract many more people than Rome, Paris, or Berlin ever could. In Italy, it was all about being abandoned by the EU and being the first point of contact for migrants coming in from Africa and the Middle East. And I just think you need to account for that. Otherwise, within reason, you're wasting your money. You're staying in your echo chamber. You will get lots of messages for people who think just like you, saying, oh, that was a great campaign, but that's not what you need. I think in this, social media is invaluable. You know, there's very little, you know, it depends who, but a lot of people stick with the newspaper they read and the TV channel that they have. And I think sometimes on social media, I mean, you get echo chambers there as well, but a lot of like, you know, social media videos will still get reshared. I think they have slightly more chance of reaching beyond. I think you need to get to the people that, I wouldn't say hate you, but hate your message. And try to get, but to do that, you need to address in an almost like detailed, specific way, what you know the counter argument being made by them is. So when I am in Italy, I know the anti-migration arguments off by heart. And if I go in any conference and no one's asked me those and I haven't had the time, not even to rebut, to dismiss, because, you know, a lot of these arguments are not unfounded. You know, Italians being angry about the EU not having decided to properly share migrants, it's not an unfounded per se racist opinion. It can be twisted, and often is. But I just think you can only do that if you tailor and target. It costs money. You need people that speak the language. And of course, it's funny. I always think on a media point of view, you know, the Arab world is so split, so many countries, you know, different religions, but they have the common language. So you can have an Al Jazeera in the Arab world. The EU, we have a, you know, a proper political union, but we don't have a common language. And that has always been the Achilles heel of the European Union. And we need to counter that. And I don't think there's any way around it than actually using the specific, not just the languages. You don't just give this to translators. You give this to journalists who will tailor it so that the message gets to where it needs to get. That it's going to be a story that will in some ways define your career. I think, if it's someone starting out now, to get to know both sides, to travel. I mean, I know it's hard to say in post-COVID-19 times, but to go to places and to speak to people. To remember that there's more that unites us than divides us. I know this may sound a bit airy-fairy, but it's true. To do their homework when it comes to understanding the migrant flows, to always, you know, to speak to as many people as possible outside of the echo chamber. Because even within, you know, this world of journalists and, you know, NGOs, and there is an echo chamber within that as well. So to step outside it, to always go on the ground and speak to people affected. There is never any excuse for not doing that. If you're ever doing a report on migration without a migrant in there somewhere, I mean, I know that sometimes it's unavoidable, you know, heaven knows 24-hour news channels, we've sometimes, you know, sometimes you need to put stuff out. But that is almost unforgivable. You always need to have the voices of the people that are affected. And also, and this may be hard, but in a way it shouldn't be, get to grips with what the criticism is. You know, ask the people that are against migration why, and listen to them, and don't automatically just dismiss what they're saying, because otherwise you lose the trust of viewers. And once you've lost the trust, anything you do is pointless.